Hello, everyone. So I'm Russell Raphael. I have a little group called North London Ulysses, and this is a slightly different video to one that I would normally produce, where I talk about Ulysses and give my views on it, Ulysses by James Joyce, because today I'm delighted to be joined by Siobhan McElduff, all the way out there in Canada at the University of British Columbia. And Siobhan, I'm not sure that we are related, but certainly you're related to my wife, Claire,
Yeah. So
because
yes, I know your in-laws. I feel like you're in the larger sense of cousins that people have in Ireland. You're included in the not like the second category, which is
I
just pretty
qualify.
much
Right.
anybody
I'm not
can
sure
join.
it'll get me an Irish passport, but
No,
I
regrettably, but
might
yeah,
apply.
I can't believe none of you have like a Irish grandparent in there. I don't know how you manage
No,
that.
we didn't. Right. So your mum and my wife, Claire's mum, are sisters, and
Mhm.
thankfully they are both still going strong. One here in England, one up in Scotland, and you've made your way out to University of British Columbia, where you're an associate professor of Latin literature and Roman culture. And so we, in my group, we read this book, Ulysses by James Joyce. And although if I say chapter 7 Aeolus, someone will point out to me, there aren't any chapters, and technically that's sort of true, but it divides up into convenient bits. And there's a particular bit that Joyce suggested might be called Aeolus, which is set in a newspaper office where journalists on a breezy day create their own wind and hot air, and by making or referring to various speeches and talking about good speeches and not such good speeches. And the chapter has come to, Joyce suggested it might be called Aeolus. And for the ordinary reader like me, one might read through it and pick up certain things, but one of the things I wouldn't pick up on would be the art of rhetoric, had I not read some clues that Joyce left and said one of the techniques of this chapter or this episode is rhetoric and empithemic. Is that the word? We might go, well, hopefully we will get on to it. And so it turns out that the skeleton of the episode sort of runs along classical rules. And we have an associated professor in the extended family that knows something of these technicalities, I thought, why not ask Siobhan and ask her about this chapter. So because with your knowledge on rhetoric and my knowledge of the book, I'm hoping we can make a bit of sense of it. And just to I explain you're an associate professor of Latin literature and Roman culture, and I think Cicero features quite a lot in that. And I think you've written books on Cicero, as well as several other aspects of this. And is that a fair intro? Do you think you will be able to contribute something on rhetoric?
Yes, I hope so. At any rate, like I have done, so I have done translations of Cicero, and I've worked a lot on his concepts of literature, so under which rhetoric falls as a sort of, I guess, a category of like literature, and his concepts of style, and also, I guess, Aristotle in Cicero. And if you read Cicero, you have to read Aristotle and sort of basic works on rhetoric. So yes, in Greek.
Okay,
Culture.
that's great. Well, so let's see how we go. So the structure of the episode sort of runs around 4 speeches. three main ones and then a little one at the end. And the first one is a very flowery one, which was reported the previous evening in a newspaper. And it's very flattering of ancient Ireland. And when I say ancient, sort of mythical Ireland, and then embodying maybe even various rebellions into that. And it's written by someone called Dan Dawson, who was a local politician at the time, real or I'm not, I don't think, certainly it was based on someone real. And then the people in this newspaper office are reading it from the day before, and they're sort of taking the mickey out of it about the over flowery language. And then we have a bit later in the chapter, the editor of the newspaper says, oh, there's no journalists these days like there used to be, and there's no barristers and lawyers like there used to be. And he's harking back to this golden age, and he and someone else talks about this barrister, and he gives a brilliant speech about Moses. Moses features quite heavily in the episode, and it gets off this murderer. But the speech, and apparently that's supposed to be a forensic style, but the jury, the impression is given that the jury was so much more wowed by the sounds of the words rather than what was being said. And so, but that's supposed to be an example of forensic sort of evident rhetoric. And then there's a third speech at a meeting that is encouraging the use of Irish, the Irish literary revival, and part of a growing movement, obviously, about throwing off the shackles of British imperialism. But part of that is that we should be jettisoning British and using Irish as much as we can. And a speech was given again about Moses and the ancient Israelites being liberated from Egypt, and that the British being likened to the Egyptians and the ancient Israelites likened to the Irish in bids for freedom. And again, another really beautiful, eloquent speech, but that wooed with its sounds rather than was there, what is the point? Is there really a link between ancient peoples or even modern Jews and the Irish? What was that going on? And it sort of won the day in the debating room, but did it win it more from the rhetoric than what was being said? And then finally, one of our heroes in the book, Stephen Dedalus, says what seems to be a sort of nonsense story called The Parable of the Plums, but actually, if you had there was a lot more going on beneath the word. It was sort of the opposite. The others were all words potentially without meaning. What Stephen said, the words weren't so great on the face of it, but actually there was real deep and hidden meaning. So that's where the chapter sort of flows. And I've written down some questions. My first question is, what in general terms are Aristotle's rules of rhetoric?
Okay, so Aristotle is the first formal text we have on rhetoric. There were ones written before him. So I feel like in the interest of larger understandings, but Aristotle is the sort of first text that we have that lays out some general rules, and categorizes rhetoric into three areas, roughly the areas you've described, like forensic before courts, epidictic, which is more you can call it display if that's easier for people, forensic is really about proving a point. You're proving a point, but you're proving you're trying to get somebody off, so you're arguing a specific way. With display speeches, you are trying to prove a point, but it is more about, I guess, unleashing the full power of your rhetoric, because you know, you're trying to like entertain people and please them as well as persuade, like nothing sort of, so it's very important to have very pleasing speech. And I think that is a general rule of like rhetoric too. And then you have deliberative, like where you're trying to say before, like say something like the Senate, or before like a debating society where you're sort of deliberating on an actual path of action. Like, you know, there's an actual decision you're trying to push. In display oratory, sometimes you might just be praising somebody or attacking them. You're just trying to persuade people that they're a good person or that you hate them justly. So like both invective and praise fall within display. So they are really like flip sides of the same coin. So eulogies, things like that. At a funeral, that would be the bit where, you know, you pull out all the poetry. Even in English, like we do that, you know. Those are much more very different from how you normally would talk about somebody. So that's a good example. I don't know, like deliberative, like rhetoric is so poorly attended to these days. I'm trying to think of other examples, but yeah. So that's roughly the three categories of rhetoric. They are supposed to have different, like, sort of structures. In a court, you might be questioning people. You might want pithier sentences because people might have less patience. The jury in Athens was made up of just anybody, any male, free male, like they were paid. So you really can't like assume anything. So, but you know, with other forms, you can pull out things. So I think roughly, if you're thinking about the ways that some of these speeches work, the categorization kind of works. Like the flowery speech is clearly sort of like a fancy, just like fancy things. But I think in terms of sound, like the sound of both Latin and Greek rhetoric is incredibly important to both, and it's a thing that Aristotle talks about. So if we are talking about him in general through the Jesuits, he was their philosopher. So if there's anything that I feel Joyce would know, it's Aristotle and then Cicero, because those are the two core, like really important prose texts that they're going to work with.
And funnily enough, in the book, there's a lot of Aristotle, and we've moved on to chapter 9 now, which is Scylla and Charybdis, which is all about Shakespeare. But as a backdrop to that, we have the sort of the whirlpool of Platonic thought, of simple ideas, and as against the more structural framework that Aristotle introduced. So Aristotle has, you know, he took a break in chapter 8, but he was there in chapter 7 with his rhetoric. Now he's back in full force with in chapter 9. And I think part of the theme of the book is how Stephen needs to flow and mature from being Platonic, Plato, in that he's writing, he wants to write, he wants to develop as the supreme creative artist. This is a fictional character that wants to develop into James Joyce that can write this book. And in this book, he's only age 22, and he needs to get to about his mid-30s where he can write it. And through the other main character, through Leopold Bloom, he will learn a bit more about, even though this only happens on one day, so he won't learn it this day. But in due course, one assumes he will get more life experience. He will meet a life partner, as Joyce did with Nora, and write more from his observations of other people in the world, and all being grist to his mill. He will write about experiences as opposed to writing from what he's been taught and his own internal and what he's read. So at the moment, I think he's quite, he thinks he's Aristotle. He's talking about how Shakespeare took from his life experiences, but I don't think Stephen is there yet. And part of the point of the book is about his maturity as an artist, moving from Plato to Aristotle, is my sort of understanding. But I think there might be one mention of Cicero in the whole of Ulysses. Maybe more,
Yeah,
but
he mentions him in this passage, in this thing. He mentions a fragment of Cicero, which I'd like to talk about at some point. I also feel I have to bring up another Aristotle. And I don't know, I had a look around for scholarship on this passage. So I went through like, various articles just to see what people were saying to make certain I wasn't like sort of completely, just to see like what people are like. But there's a text called Aristotle's Masterpiece.
Yes.
Now, yes, have you
Yeah.
heard of Aristotle's Masterpiece?
Oh, yes.
It was still in print in Ireland in the 1920s and 30s. And so I think like you can't never really know, like reading this passage, like which Aristotle is coming through, because that is really just a sex manual. Like it really
Yes.
is, like in some of the forms. So like there's a definitely when, this is the Jesuit one, and then there's the popular Aristotle. And you can't think when you're thinking in the printing house, because these were the sort of places, this is how they made their money. They printed anything, like, they weren't so
Yeah.
like you can't be one of those without think somehow of that Aristotle too.
Yeah. So, yeah, that comes up. Does it come up in this chapter? I hadn't
It
picked up on
doesn't,
that.
but it was in the back of my mind because I do work on printing like in the 19th century in Ireland, so I happen to know quite a bit about
Right.
the
Well, in
circulation of
chapter
these things.
10, either Stephen or Bloom see it in a market stall, and they're
Yeah,
flipping through it. And unfortunately, we uncharitably, and probably one can't say in a shouldn't say this now, but we very uncharitably might refer to freaks or people, babies born with no arms or something horrible, and it will be a book of photo. I think it is a book of photographs of that sort of thing, and
it's
absolutely
woodcuts probably woodcuts because it's too cheap for photographs.
right, but absolutely nothing to do with Aristotle. But someone 150 years ago came up with a good idea of we'll call it Aristotle's Master. And I think Molly in the final chapter, she's heard her husband Bloom talk about it, and and I think she refers to some aristocrat's masterpiece. Or so she's sort of misread. Yeah, but I think it's kind of there to throw you off the scent. And Aristotle, da, da, da. But yeah, absolutely, complete red herring.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's true, but like, I mean, I don't know, like, I mean, that book was the one thing that makes me think about it is that that book was not printed in any consistent manner. It was chaotically printed, so almost every version was slightly different because they were
Right.
chopping in the bits that they could find and stuff like this. So it's a really unstable text as well, like it really is.
Okay.
So like
Okay.
that's one like so that's just one thing that always interests me when
Right.
you
So Aristotle,
anyway,
so there were these three basic types of rhetoric, which broadly correspond to the three
yeah.
speeches that we've heard. Why did Aristotle feel the need for these to construct the rules? Is it that he was observing people using it and he thought, I'm going to call that out, or what?
Well, the rhetoric is like not a manual in sense, but it is like about how to be a good orator. So it's about how to speak properly. And so he categorizes things. So there's a lot of thing about proofs and stuff like this. This enthymemes that you were referring to, we can talk about them as proofs. So he comes up with things like syllogisms as ways to prove things. And I think definitely, for example, the Israelites and the as the Irish and the English as the Egyptians, that might be one such, but it's a bit buried. So, for example, a syllogism might be something like Socrates is mortal. All humans, Socrates is mortal, therefore he will die. And that depends on all of us agreeing on the fact that everybody human dies. Yes, so you can just say that, and that's an understood it sort of proof. Like, but there's three steps, or you could state it. The first step would being Socrates is mortal, or all humans are mortal. Then Socrates is mortal is a smaller category. Therefore, Socrates must die. Okay, but you can also rely on beliefs, like for example, the truism that in fact the Israelites escape Egypt against great odds and overwhelming power. If the Irish are like the Israelites, therefore they will also escape the English. So
Right.
I mean, like that rests on a very dodgy connection there. And
Yes.
that's the problems with syllogisms, because you can base them on things that aren't like as sort of understood things, like, and even the one about all humans are mortal doesn't really work in a culture where you believe that people can gain immortality, can become gods, or become famous through their writings, as Socrates does, and that's what immortality exists of. So persists. So I think it's like one of those things where like syllogisms are, there's something that is an essential element of like sort of like proving things, but they are, you can use them in very manipulative ways.
And right, and I understand that if we move from that to an enthymemic, that is where if a syllogism is a stool with three legs, so and it sort of stands up, that all you know, all dogs are this, and therefore, and that is that, therefore that is a dog. But you could remove one of those legs, and then the stool is far less stable. And you're saying that even with a syllogism, it allows for a lot, there's a lot of room for doubt. But if you remove one of those legs, then you're allowing for even more assumptions, mistaken or otherwise, that come in. And my understanding of an enthymemic, which I think is what Joyce said is one of the techniques of this chapter, is where one is saying X, such and such is X, he is such, therefore, without, and you don't even have to mention that last bit. It's almost a given, and that allows for prejudicial beliefs and all sorts of assumptions that might come into that.
Yes, and you have to think about one of the reasons why, like Plato in particular was very against rhetoric because they were very well aware of these things, you know, as poetry, like, and the same thing with Aristotle, like making these rules formal allows people to teach them and learn them, and it allows access to people who, to a wider group of people, which obviously people who, like Aristotle, who aristocrats don't really like, but at the same time enable. So once you write a set of rules down, they can be learned by people who otherwise might not have access to teachers. So it becomes the rhetoric, Aristotle's rhetoric is an important text for that. Like the ones going around there. So, and then Cicero's orator depends in part on Aristotle's rhetoric. So Cicero wrote a lot on rhetoric and the style of rhetoric, and he uses a lot of Aristotle and other people with his own stuff. So those two things sort of get fused because for a very long time, Aristotle was only available really through Cicero because he wasn't circulating in textual form in the West. So
I see. Okay.
so like when you get to ideas, they kind of fix. So Thomas Aquinas would have understood, would have been like Cicero, he would have, if he, like his Aristotle would have come like hugely influenced by Cicero and stuff like that. So yeah.
And what was it through? Was Thomas Aquinas a Jesuit? I get a bit mixed up about
They
when the
rely on
Jesuit.
him a lot, like when they're talking, because he's one of their core people. So like he uses a lot of like classical rhetoric in a way that works within sort of, I guess, the theology. So I think he is a core author for them. He's a core author for, I mean, like they're intellectuals, so he's a core theological author. He's really important. He wrote like a lot on the nature of the soul. So yes, and also is a very pleasant read, I have to say, in Latin. Like some people, I don't really necessarily like what they're saying, but they're very pleasant. Other people, they feel unpleasant. That introduces new things I don't think we need to talk about, but I do think, yes, Joyce would have been very well educated in all of these, but because for Jesuits, Aristotle was the philosopher. In the same way, though, Cicero was their rhetorician because he did not just write an oratory, he was an orator. So you can see them
Right.
in action in different types of speeches.
My understanding of the Jesuits, and through that, I'm ashamed to say, Catholicism quite generally is largely gleaned through Ulysses. So through you know, and various friends, but largely through this book in terms of many technicalities. So I'm learning it through a blaspheming atheist or a blaspheming agnostic at the very least, someone that totally rejected it. But when you're, but what did ring true for me, what you just said, there's an episode later in the book called Ithaca, the penultimate the penultimate episode, which is the style of it is a catechism. So question and answering. And my understanding is that that is the catechism, is that one learns by rote a lot of ritualistic Catholica and Catholic religion. But I can see that. I can see the appeal of Aristotle, a very structured approach to that. And that this is this. You don't need to think too much behind it, just accept that it is. And it's, so in general terms, if Plato was thinking about, well, does time really exist? Does space really exist? Is that important? What's much more important than time or space is love and emotion and loyalty and this sort of stuff. Whereas Aristotle comes along and says, you know what, we just need to get through the day. And I get that it's nice to love people, but let's also think about, let's have some definitions and some structure and some, work things out. So I can see that if you are an organized religion to which you want millions and millions of people to adhere, you do need some set rules. And it's quite convenient to have people just to say, learn this, learn that, learn that. Or am I being grossly unfair?
General terms, but I feel like the Jesuits definitely, like, although like I'm not a practicing Catholic, like having realized like they aspire to a higher level of intellectualism, like in a sense, like for them, like I think if you look at sort of like, to quote the current moment, what's coming out of Georgetown versus like other places in responses to like, in response to bizarre letters, they're much more like, they're just written in a style that is like just, polishes the floor with person rhetorically as well as just pointing things out. So I feel like in some senses the Jesuits it is a formalized system and it'll always be within that. But there's also questions which I must admit I don't always understand about how they present the immortality of the soul and like sort of like, things like this. And but Plato is definitely more dangerous and trickier. But I also think, and also like I think probably comes through one of their things is to turn out people who give sermons and persuade people and convert
Yeah,
people, and you have to do that, and also to deal with, people in authority. They're a wealthy order as well.
yeah,
So
yeah.
like I feel like
Right.
yeah. Anyway,
Great. So
so
so apparently the episode runs to, although we talked about the three basic types of rhetoric, as I'm then given to understand, a speech generally is made of 7 components, which I've written them down. I think is it globally called the ad horennium,
yes, yeah,
the
that one is just
exordium,
yes,
narratio, divisio,
the author, yeah.
confirmatio, refutatio, confutatio, and conclusio. And I thought it might be fun if you could explain generally what you thought each one of those did, and then I might see if I can apply it to what is happening in the episode. I don't know if I'll be able to, but we could try it.
Yeah, I have some ideas. I feel like it would be challenging to do because that's a very chaotic thing. And I do think it breaks like, because Aristotle also wrote in style. It breaks some rules of style there too, but we can do definitely, I'll take you through the areas too, if you want. I mean, they might not be, and I would say like Cicero, when you see it, these things work in Cicero, you become very aware that if you are very good at this and the case demands it, you will just chuck huge sections of that out, like as the situation demands it. Like, in a good orator, if he is hit by something from an opposing speech, will just like fling out bits that are not useful. Anyway, so
Right.
with that, so right, stage the
Thinking on his
moment and
feet.
try and express it. Yes.
Yes. So what's the exordium? What do we
It's
make?
kind of like the hook, like the bit where you come in and say something that's going to get people's attention. So, it's the sort of bit up where, to put it in his crudest terms, like you could say, like, as this row one starts, you know, I think he said, my opponent is not like, he's speaking about Julius Caesar's father-in-law. So you got to put this in this context where he says, you know, my opponent is not really a Roman, but a filthy, a rotten tooth, filthy faced guy from the East. Like, so like, that's a hook that people are going to want to listen to more of. Like, so that's your exordium, is your opening statement where you have to get people's attention.
Okay, so the way the book opens is more a general statement about Dublin, the headline in the heart of the Hibernian metropolis. But I'm thinking of John F. Taylor's speech, which was the very flowery one and the much quoted one in the Irish. He was speaking for the Irish literary revival and the whole Egyptian Israelite thing. He started off by maligning his opponent, who was a very, very pro-British and pretty patronizing to the audience. And so John F. Taylor started off by saying, well, you just heard my learned colleague, you won't be surprised by what he said and all of that. And it was kind of nicely put, but it was quite damning as well. And I can see that would have people say, oh yes, that's what we're here for. And
yeah, but I also want to say within the canons of classical rhetoric, Greek and Roman rhetoric, it's absolutely perfectly acceptable and actually preferable to say that you are standing up because you hate the other person, not for any other reason. Like you can just go in there and say, I hate this person and this is why I hate them. They are very hateable.
okay,
That's why I prosecute
cool,
them.
cool. Right, then the next one is the narratio.
So that's like you have to give like so, and I think one of the things is this is coming mainly from forensic rhetoric in courts because like the narratio, some of these can be dropped out. So the narratio assumes like a statement of events. You know, so like this is what the case is about.
Yeah.
These are a sequence of things. Like so this is, you know, so this is where you were just saying, you know, I will, you know, I will prove to you that like this senator, like, I don't know, like murdered Roman citizens and stole land and like, you know, killed people all over, like let pirates take over Sicily, etc., etc. Like these are the things that you are going to say, like, yeah, so narratio, or it could be like, this is how things happened. It doesn't have to necessarily be a true
Okay.
account.
So if I think about this episode and looking back on the episode as a whole, and what Joyce might have been trying to convey very generally, and it's about a month or so since we read it now, but I think he was sort of saying, okay, we're going to watch our young hero, Stephen Dedalus, in the company of older journalists, and he's going to have exposure to them talking about favorite speeches, and he is going to think inside rather mockingly about each of them in turn. And it's going to dawn on him that even though he wants to be a creative writer, journalism is definitely not the way to go. That is as creative as next day's meat or fish wrappers. And, you know, they're just not great. Their idea of great journalism, the example was given was about the Invincibles in 1882, and they even get the dates wrong, and they get everything that they can get wrong about the story. What was important about the story, they get it wrong, and the way they told it wasn't creative at all. So I can see that's the general gist. So that Stephen will think a plague on all your houses from whatever point of view you're coming from. This is not the sort of writing I want to get into. I think that's what we are sort of left with there. I hope I'm anyway.
Again, like, yeah, you don't have to like, I mean, it's definitely you can drop some of these categories. Like,
okay.
so I think like one of the things to think about is whether or not the categories are more present within the speeches that you have in there. And in some ways, Joyce might be making fun of people who adhere too much to categories, or the overall story is a thing. So I feel like, I mean, I don't like, I mean, most of what I know about Joyce is not through Ulysses, but like, you know, I feel like it's hard to know, like, he's obviously very slippery. So like, it's hard to know if some of that is about, you know, that, you know, flexibility and the ability to sort of like you know, to think about what's appropriate is more important in good rhetoric. And I think that's one of the things that Aristotle and Cicero stress. You have to be relevant for the moment.
Okay, thank
Sorry,
you.
so
Oh,
just to
certainly
connect those
Joyce
things,
is
sort of.
capable of sending you off in that direction, and particularly the professors, with all respect to professors generally, send them down that rabbit hole, whereas actually the more interesting point is somewhere over here, and it's much easier and better for the ordinary reader. And he's very capable of that, and is mischievous in that regard. Right, that though the divisio, so this sounds as though it ought to be some point of departure between the
Yeah, because where you're
argument.
sort of like, there are like transitory passages and things like this. So you're sort of like, you're sectioning yourself off. So there's a lot of these are like, so some of these can be very, very short too. Like a divisio is just like, you know, sort of when you're sort of separating yourself off from, you need to move from one to the other. You can't just say like, you know, and now for like my bit where I talk about X. So there's usually some sort of transition where like, you know.
So there is a lot of a word I've used to describe the episode is staccato. There's a lot of stopping and starting and and it's sort of blowy, and doors blow open. People have described it as breathing in and breathing out, some of the rhythm. And I know you want to talk a bit, I think, about the rhythm of some of the so-called headlines, but the rhythm of some of the passages. So where have I? Should have marked it, shouldn't I? Right at the beginning of the book, of the episode, about the Guinness and the right. So there's a there's a paragraph that reads, it's under the headline of Gentlemen of the Press. So it's our first hint that this is going to be about newspapers or what have you. And it says, gross-booted draymen rolled barrels dull thudding out of Prince's stores and bumped them up on the brewery float. On the brewery float bumped dull thudding barrels rolled by gross-booted draymen out of Prince's stores. So it's almost breathing in and then breathing out again, with the words going in one way and out in the other way. And so
Can we
this,
talk about rhythm? I would love to talk about rhythm here because you have brought it up, and I do think it's something in the passage that is easy for people to perhaps tease out and enjoy in some ways, and it tells you something different, I think, about the rhetoric. Would that be, we could spend
sure.
a few minutes on, because one of the things that Aristotle talks about is rhythm, all right, as how it's very important the words sound pleasant, that you have good rhythms in your speech. And especially, this was true towards the ends. So the Greeks and the Romans didn't have punctuation in their texts. So how you were sometimes, or just so when you were reading, you were often reading for certain ending rhythms of sort of words, patterns of sounds. And when you were listening, that would tell you someone was concluding a period. And there is a passage in there where he talks about a lovely period. So this is very important. It's also very important to Cicero. It was also a thing where if you had to keep balancing a line between pleasing rhythm and not moving into poetry. So that was the line. It had to sound good, but not poetic. So it's like you couldn't break into song,
Yeah.
essentially, because poetry was sung. So, but you had to sound like something people would like to hear it. So there's certain sound patterns that are preferred, particularly Cicero writes a lot about this, and you can actually scan the ends of his speeches to get certain sounds. So long shorts, because Latin goes with long shorts, but that would be stressed, unstressed in English. So because English doesn't do long shorts, it does stressed, unstressed, you know.
What does that mean? Give me an example
So
of that.
like you put stress, so like if you think about a word like margarine, you're putting the stress on which syllable there?
The third.
Yeah, the third. But like, so that's so marger, and it comes also, you can put it into the verse marger, but you have to put no stress on the middle one. Okay,
Yeah.
that's different for Americans, so they may be trying to figure it's margarine for them, so they put it on the middle one. But so that would be like stressed, unstressed, stressed in English. So
Okay.
I feel like that's one where you can think about it. So and but Latin, that's so there are these, but Romans and Greeks listened for this, and it is a sort of thing that you're supposed to do. And so it is a really pivotal part of the language. You can undercut what you're saying by choosing the wrong rhythm too. So if something is really, really bouncy, but it shouldn't be, then you are perhaps doing the equivalent of a sarcastic tone by using the wrong rhythm. So if you say like, or if you say, I'm saying this really seriously, like that is
Yeah.
obviously an
Yeah.
indication that you are not taking it seriously. So you can use your prose rhythms that way. So it's one way that you can indicate to the audience that you do not agree with what you're so without having to say it. So
Right.
so if you think about passages where they're serious, but it's bump, 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 or they're imitating, say it's people representing English language, but the stresses are Irish, like English people speaking, the stresses are Irish. You can think about that as a sort of like commentary on what's being written.
Yeah, I get it.
So
So
like,
what we've got here are this episode is punctuated by these headlines, for want of a better word. And it's a generalization, but they do seem to get a bit longer as it goes on. And some of them, I'm wondering if some of them belie what is. So there's one that simply says sad, but I think that may well be a good comment. But there's another one that says what Weather Up said. And Weather Up, he gets a headline. And yet when you get into the paragraph, it's all about the entrance of the editor of the newspaper. And the editor of the newspaper, a chap called Miles Crawford, is a modern day correspondent to King Aeolus. Now, the whole episode, Joyce said, is called Aeolus. So the bloke whose real name was Aeolus, you'd think has some importance here. And lo and behold, he is the editor of the newspaper. And here he comes out of his office with some grandeur, and it's the first time we meet him. Yet it's under the headline, What Weather Up said. And this bloke's name is not Weather Up. Weather Up is so minor a character in the book that he is mentioned there in that headline, and he is mentioned one other time in the whole 900 odd pages or whatever it is in an equally minor way. And it's almost as though we're saying, here comes the editor. He's got an inflated view of his own self-importance. The headline's not going to be about him. It's going to be about some other guy that's an absolute irrelevance to the whole of the book. Might that fit with what you're saying?
well, it's interesting because I actually, as I said, I went through a lot of, I went through some people's articles just about, like, because I went looking for what people said about rhetoric in this passage, because I was interested just to have a bit of background, as I said, about what people had already talked about, to sort of see if people talked about Cicero, to see if anything I was saying. So, and that is, yeah. So, but one of the things that strikes me about these, I went through online and cut them all out, is if you go through them, some of them, like there's certain preferred rhythms in prose to end in a certain way. Some of those, like omnium gatherum, are exactly on those types. Like if you think about omnium gatherum, that's like, like that's kind of like, so
All the
these,
times.
yeah, like, so like these are types of things. But if they actually, and this, I hope this isn't too like, for anybody who's managed to make their way through all of this, at the end of every, say, sentence or period where you're wrapping up and you're telling people this is the end of the period, you put those riddles in for the end of the thing above, not with what's below. So I can't work out, like on those rules, I couldn't work out if whether upset was with what was above or what was below. And when I looked at this, I was wondering, are those a commentary? If they are scannable, I scanned a few, and they do, like, there's a couple of like structures that are very Ciceronian. So I like, so like, yeah, so I don't want to go into it, but like it did strike me as like, yeah, like, do you actually know? It's very destabilizing. Like once because they sound, a lot of them sound very pretty if you just say them as phrases,
And they get, yes, so I read it aloud, because I read this now every Monday evening in a pub nearby. And it's been one of the great experiences of my life that I've had the honor for 5 years now, every week, of reading this book out loud to a smallish audience. And it's a brilliant book to be able to read. But I think a lot of books are better if you read them out loud. It's harder to read out loud to yourself. So when you have to perform it, you hear it with slightly different ears. And these headlines are one of the more joyous occasions of the book. The ones towards the end that get very long. Virgilian says, pedagogue, sophomore plumps for old man Moses. And then even longer, the very last one in the book, which is, I haven't counted the words among the headline as compared to what follows it, but I bet they're pretty close. Diminished digits prove too titillating for frisky frumps, and Wimbles flow wangles, yet can you blame them? That's the last headline in the book, which is almost an article in itself. And essentially what that is talking about is that in Stephen's story, these two getting on in life ladies have climbed Nelson's pillar. And when they get to the top, they are so overcome by the statue of Nelson with his diminished digits, because one hand isn't there, but his nether regions, as they are looking straight up at them, are fairly close to them. So this statue proves too titillating for frisky frumps, and they sit back and don't do it. They can't, and it's all allegoric. It's supposed to be reasonably allegoric on the state of Irish resistance to the British at the time, that they climb the greatest symbol of empire in Dublin, and yet when they get to the top, they're mainly overcome by the very large appendage of Nelson, way too close to their faces than they could have imagined, and they've got a bit of vertigo, and the climb was steeper than they thought. And then when they look out, all they can see are churches. There's Adam and Eve's, and there's this one and that one and Thomas, whatever. And so the sort of the authority of the church over Dublin, and it's all fragmented, and it makes them all dizzy, and blah blah blah. And so it's all quite allegorical.
And also a rhetorical technique too. One of the things that both Cicero and Aristotle recommend is like using things around you. So when you're orating, like you point to statues, so they will say things like, this god, that this statue of like Jupiter or Zeus has to see this like terrible, terrible thing, such as my opponent saying I chopped down their olive trees, like because there's a whole case about olive stumps, in the sacred olive stumps in Greek rhetoric, which is like about some guy, like, so anyway, and or other things like this. So yeah, so or other things, or sort of like, that he has to, for Cicero, that this statue has to look down on Anthony and his sins. So yeah, so these things are all like, there's so much in here that is so also part of like just embedded into like, what do you do in rhetoric? Well, and the only thing they have is, yes, his appendage, the wrong one.
Okay. I fear I've kept you on here longer than I said I would. So I'll
Yeah.
try and draw things to a close. If I can return to the 7 things, and we'll skip a couple of them because you
Okay.
said we said we can. And I think it's fair to say that Stephen's story about these two ladies might be the refutatio, because he's actually saying that the speech is no, all words, all mouth and no trousers is not actually where we ought to be going, and that's not going to get us very far. We need maybe less words, but with quite a lot of deep meaning behind them. And then it ends with something called, well, the confutatio and the conclusio. The conclusio, obviously, I guess the conclusion, we make of it what we will. What's the confutatio?
Sorry, yes. Well, we were going. Sorry, I'm like, yes. Sorry, I'm not going to. Yeah, the confutatio. So, refutatio, like you've sort of like in the refutatio, you've kind of taken so if you're thinking about like his refutatio, it would be taking all the speeches that have gone before and in his speech pointing out that those are all wrong. So you've taken all the evidence that the other side has, those 3 previous speeches, demolish them. Okay.
Yeah.
The confutatio is you also want to restate what your thing is, like, so like you can
Right.
restate, like, or so so you can, like, so not all of these things, sometimes you can so conclusively demolish like the other side in a refutatio, you don't need to restate it, but there's usually some sort of thing like, the end of the speech from Milo's, I'm crying because he's such a good man, are you gonna throw him out of Rome? Like, yeah, Milo was not a good man. So
Right.
Cicero has some very, very dodgy clients. So anyway, but yeah,
Okay.
and then you conclude usually, and it can be very simple. You can just simply say, "I have spoken," but you got to
Right.
tell people you're ending. Like, like you got to tell people it's ended. Like, there's not just an awkward silence. So like, so you can, like, and at that time, there's certain points. So with this thing is people are doing lots of gestures, and at some point, and I think this definitely would be a text that at some point Joyce had gone on to with Quintilian, who also talks about this, is a later guy who writes on rhetoric than Cicero. So he's sort of under the Empire. Cicero's into the Republic, where oratory was like really, really vicious. Like you just like went right at each other, like as like you like it was like basically trying to take, yeah, you just full bodied, you just say whatever came into your head and then just worried about it later. You did try to have evidence in court cases, but like in the Senate. So, and then you have under the Empire where it's more restrained, but like you sort of get these sort of situations where, like people sort of just can't remember where I was going with this, but just sort of thinking this through, like, it's like as a sort of system, like it is meant to avoid everything that happens as a whole in that passage. So anyway, I don't know where I was going that in the first place, but like I was going somewhere very
Well,
important.
okay, but
I can blame that fact that
why
I've
don't I
exhausted
let you
necessary
know
papers.
how the episode actually
Yeah,
ends? So
sorry.
that headline says, so the diminished digits prove too titillating for frisky frumps, and wimbles, flow wangles, yet can you blame them? And then we have a bit of dialogue. Oh, one-handed adulterer, he said grimly. That tickles me, I must say. And then the editor, our King Aeolus, Miles Crawford, says, oh, tickled the old ones too, Miles Crawford said, if the God's Almighty's truth was known. So Miles Crawford is announcing that something is the God Almighty's truth. And the episode ends on that. So, I mean, although there is the word if, so it's conjecture, but it seems to me that from what you've just said about you end with something definitive. So we're almost saying, Amen, God's truth, to which I think Joyce subscribes a far deeper meaning in the context of one of the books I've got behind me is by Sheldon Breivik, Joyce the Creator, and it's about that Stephen will go on to become the maturer James Joyce, who will create all of these characters. So he is the God's truth. Stephen's truth. What Stephen has just said is God's truth, because Stephen actually will be the author of this book. And so I think in quite a deep way, but maybe that's a sort of, might that be like amen to the whole episode as a final word?
Yeah, I mean, you have to have something. I mean, and of course, like this is obviously like a thing where like, I mean, it's a very fluid text, I guess. It's sort of like, in the way it adheres to norms, which is to say it doesn't, like, you know what I mean? Like, or
Yeah.
the sort of traditions of things. But yeah, and it's, yeah, like, and it is. And also, I think there's one thing that sort of both Cicero and Aristotle would say, which I think also wraps up with sort of thinking about Stephen Bloom, is that both of them would argue that an orator has to be a good person. So it's not quite as morally threadbare as it otherwise sounds, that you can understand these rules, but both of them are like, I mean, obviously good according to their criteria, which I hope are not ones we share, because like the Greeks and the Romans were terrible people, just terrible
Right.
people. Great rhetoric, great writing. But yeah, but I think the idea is also, that there's some sort of moral sort of quotient in sort of
That's
like,
very interesting.
I don't know, like if that's reaching too far, but
No, absolutely. It isn't, because one might argue that the thread of the book is that for all his personal failings, Leopold Bloom's essential humanity and goodness, and he does many things wrong, and there are many, his adopted church, he's become Catholic. They would not look kind. The Catholic Church would not look kindly on many things that Bloom gets up to in this book, but his basic humanity is I think what we are supposed to take from the book, and what carries us forward, and the hope that on the 17th of June, the next day, life will start to improve for him, and and Molly, and in due course Stephen. They'll have some sort of positive influence on the young James Joyce that will become James Joyce. So there we are. That was an optimistic note to end on.
well, we
Right.
need some optimism these days. So yeah.
Yes, we do. Siobhan, this has been brilliant. I'm so grateful that you've helped me with this, and I know what you've said will be very interesting to my little band of people that watch these things, and I hope I can cope with the technology and get it out there.
Well, thank you. It's been very interesting, especially, I mean, I did go through the passage. I did sort of like the actual chapter of, but yes, but it's also like you're very aware that I'm not entirely sure what happens after this. It was, yes.
And one of what we haven't got onto, but what will be a very interesting question is, what the hell you made of that in isolation in the middle of a really difficult book, and you hadn't read what comes before or after. Did it even mean anything?
It does. I mean, partially because they're talking about things that I kind of know about, and also Cicero did come up, and like I have thoughts about McHugh's like expertise on Ciceronian oratory. If he thinks my lovely land came from the speeches and not the poetry, this very exceedingly bad poetry. But that's a topic for another day.
Okay, well, perhaps we'll do a part two. And maybe I know you've run for the hills rather than read Ulysses to
No,
this
I
point.
hope to get back to it. It is a terrible, like, it's one of those things people always ask you, especially as someone in the classics who's Irish, and you have to admit, like, I failed, like, and I managed to read like Clarissa, which has to be one of the most English novels ever, like, which is like the first long, and it goes on, it's even longer than like Ulysses. So I have no excuse. I'm just like for this total failure as a
Well,
sort of Irish woman.
it's been really nice speaking with you, and look forward to meeting you again on social occasions.
Yes.
And yeah, and I will. Claire sends her love and all of that.
And
And
my love to everyone back there, and I hope everything's going well for him.
yeah, all the kids are all fine. Are all fine.
Yeah, great.
Yeah,
Cheers.
brilliant.
Stay safe.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Bye.